Welcome to Killer Women with your host, best-selling author Danielle Girard. The Killer Women vodcast is pleased to be a part of the Authors on the Air Global Radio Network. To learn more about Danielle and her books, visit her at www.daniellegirard.com, and to access all of our vodcasts, go to youtube.com/Authors on the Air. And now, Danielle's next killer woman.
Hello, and welcome to the Killer Women podcast, a proud member of the Authors on the Air Global Network with over 4 million listeners. I'm your host, suspense author Danielle Girard, and my guest today is Ashley Winstead. Ashley is the author of In My Dreams, I Hold a Knife, Fool Me Once, and The Last Housewife. She's a former academic turned novelist with a PhD in English literature. Ashley lives in Houston with her husband, 2 cats, and beloved wine fridge. Welcome, Ashley.
Hi, thank you so much, Danielle. I'm so happy to be here.
Oh, I'm so happy to have you. And I was just showing you before we started recording what I have done to my I have all these moments in this book that I just fell in love with. Ashley, you are brilliant. This book is so full of true woman moments. And true man. I mean, I love men. I always have to sort of say that because I feel like my podcast is really about women. I'm a fan of men as well, but this is, we are talking about women today. And there's so many rich insights and truths here. So before I start to, go on and on and on about how much I love this book, why don't you tell our listeners a little bit about The Last Housewife?
Yeah, thank you so much. So in a nutshell, The Last Housewife is about a woman who goes undercover in a patriarchal sex cult to find out the truth about what happened to her former best friend whose body was found on their old college campus. So that's my little tiny elevator pitch.
Totally.
Because I normally talk a lot about the plot of my book, and I'm starting to learn, that maybe just a tiny teaser is.
Well, that's a really good teaser. And I'm glad you talk about the sex cult because, it's something obviously we want to explore in this conversation. It's so interesting. Yeah. But before we do that, I also, of course, read, and I'm a big fan of this book. So here's the dual, and I haven't read the third book, but I'm sure I'll get to it. But these are your thrillers, and I love this one. Both of these books center around or start with sort of the core of women in college. And I sort of was curious about that because, is that what's the draw of that time in women's lives for you? Because it obviously has appeal.
Yeah, I love that question. That's actually a question my agent asks me a lot because I send her a lot of ideas, and so many of them, even beyond these 2 books, have college in them. And she's actually put me on a little bit of a college ban in terms of writing future books. But so I think a little bit of it is just my life. Like I spent 10 years on college campuses between my undergrad and my PhD. So that is a third of my life that is just in that environment. I think it's, it was also 18 through 30. So it was where I grew up essentially. And so many of my my own personal experiences with coming to understand my identity, being exposed to people who, just outside of my all the places that I grew up and being exposed to class difference and so on, center around college. But I think just universally for people who, especially for women who go to college, this is a time where it's the world cracks open, anything is possible. And it's supposed to be this great leveling field, right? Everyone has their shot on a college campus, everyone, no matter who their dad is or, their mom is, how much money they have, you're all in the dorms. It's supposed to be this level thing, but of course, class and race and popularity and all these hierarchical systems play a role. And I think that's what dark academia thrillers are so good at showing. So it's takes that campus novel that we all love from childhood boarding school stories and then just gives it a dark spin. So it just, yeah, I find a lot of inspiration from that setting, I guess.
And it's the first time that we're truly independent. So
Yeah.
a lot of things can go really wrong, right? We're
Yeah.
plus you introduce, alcohol and this, along with the freedom and then you put, fraternity boys and sorority, whatever, on campus. And
Yeah.
there's a lot of danger sort of, you know, on a college campus. And as we've seen and read about, obviously there's a lot of things that do go wrong. So I can see the appeal, and I'm sorry that your agent put a ban on it, because I kind of think it's a great launching pad and in these books, we don't spend, I mean, in My Dreams I Hold a Knife, she goes back, right? It's a reunion.
Yeah.
But we don't spend that much time really in the books as college students. So I think it's sort of, like you said, it's sort of it's the sort of foundation that these characters spring from. And in this book also you use the myth of Scheherazade. And I'm hoping you will describe that a little bit, for readers, because I thought that was a really interesting sort of way of, sectioning off the book.
Yeah, I'm so glad to talk about that, because Scheherazade and 1001 Nights has like really captured my imagination for a long time. It is so Scheherazade, for listeners who aren't familiar, is the frame narrator of 1001 Nights. And I think people will probably maybe be a little more familiar with like Aladdin and the Adventures of Sinbad and all of these stories that come out of 1001 Nights. But essentially, when you in 1001 Nights, and I was so inspired by this structure and tried to like emulate it a little bit, not to the level that 1001 Nights is able to do, but it's a collection of stories that was first told orally, and historians trace it back to India and Persia, or Iran, for like the origin of a lot of these myths. But essentially, the story goes that a king, his wife cheated on him, and in his absolute rage and anger, he beheads her, and then begins to marry the women of his kingdom one by one. He beds them, and then by dawn beheads them. And so he's going through and systematically marrying and murdering the women in his kingdom, until a woman, Scheherazade, the daughter of the executioner, steps up and says, "Father, let me marry the king." And this is such a bold move. She volunteers. She's a little protected, but she volunteers to go, and she has a plan. And that's part of the myth of Scheherazade, is that she's this very clever woman. And so she marries the king, and in bed that night, what she does is she begins to tell him a story, and the story is so captivating, and she leaves him on a hook, that he decides not to kill her that night so he can hear the rest of the story, right? And so it's supposed to be about the power of stories. And so Scheherazade is able to pull this off for 1,000 nights in a row, story after story. And when you read 1001 Nights, it's just a feat of storytelling, of structure, because it's all of these embedded stories. Like you'll be starting reading one story, and Scheherazade will say something to the king like, "Oh, and then so and so and his magical cow passed by. You don't want to hear about that." And the king will say like, "Actually, yes, I do." So all of a sudden you leave your current story and you're in the next one. It's just all these layers. And on the like after the 1,000th night, the king has fallen in love with her. So the story goes, and he weds her. He makes her like his love marriage, and decides not to kill her. So that's her prize for outwinning the king, this murderer, is that she gets to like live with him. And I just found the idea of telling stories to save your life so powerful and so relevant, obviously, to like the identity construction we all do every single day, especially as women. That idea of like frantic storytelling to appeal to men. And I've always been so dissatisfied by Scheherazade's prize. And
she should be free.
Right.
Everybody
I wanted
should
to imagine like
free all
something
women.
else.
Yes. Yes.
So that's where that comes from.
It's fabulous. And I think as writers, especially, right, we are saving our lives. We hope we're saving our readers as well by telling stories of women's truths, which I think is a really powerful thing. And when somebody reaches out to me, and I know this has happened to you as well, and says your story resonated with me in such a strong way, and I thank you so much for writing it. That is the most powerful response, right?
It kind of knocks me on my ass for like, I can't really do anything for a solid hour or so. Just
Right.
It feels sacred.
It is sacred. And I think especially, and I have so many things to unpack about this, so I don't want to get ahead of myself. I'm going to back up. I'm going to do that story comes later. So the other thing is, I think it's interesting, like, does this story also somehow, I mean, it symbolizes, somewhat the plight of women, right?
Yeah.
The general plight of women, that we need, only if we sort of tame the beasts of our world by, telling stories. And so how constrained does that make us?
Oh, absolutely. It's like, it's a performance. Life is a performance. And that's something that I was trying to get at with Shay. And that's something that Shay, my main character in The Last Housewife, and something that she very much feels. In fact, her life has been such a performance for so long in so many different ways that she has lost the ability to tell what's real in her own mind, of her own desires, of her own feelings, and what feels like it's hers, but has really emerged because she understands it needs to be there, or people are expecting it.
Right.
And so her mission, she has a lot of missions in this book, but one of them is like figuring out who she is, untangling the real from the performance, and then trying to decide what to do when she finally confronts who she really is.
Right. Which is a very exciting scene, shall we say.
Yeah.
But also another main, really important character in this book, actually, and really adds sort of a depth and a reflection to Shay's character, is Jamie, who is somebody, a man that she grew up, with, who's known her her whole life. And of course, his vision of her is from when they were kids. So he doesn't, there's a lot of layers of her that are different, and they were disconnected for, quite a long time. I don't know how many years. You probably can.
Around 8 years.
Yeah, around 8 years.
A little bit longer than that. Yeah.
Okay, so they were disconnected, and it is the death of this friend, as you mentioned, who's left on the college campus, that makes sort of where they reconnect, because she's listening to he's a true crime podcaster, and that so in the book is some of the book is done in transcript form, which is so interesting because Jamie has a personal attachment to Shay, of course, because they've grown up together and they really care about each other. So he's here he is trying to be the the observer, the distance observer in his podcast. And of course, that's very, very challenging for him. And he's a lovely character. So one of the things, and I have all these, this is what I've done here, is I have all these notes I've made. But one of the things I thought was really interesting, and I sort of want to crack into, is the idea of agency.
Yeah.
So in the interviews, Jamie asks Shay why she found the dominance aspect of the relationship with Dawn, who is the sort of leader of this sex cult, so appealing. And and then basically he corrects himself and he says, you were victims. And Shay's response, which I of course wrote down here, is, I don't know about that word. What did you call yourself when you'd taken an active role in your own suffering? When your hands weren't clean? When there wasn't a single part of you that was, especially not your mind, there wasn't a single part of you that was, especially not your mind, I've missed a word here, all those deep, dark corners. So, and I wrote down the page so I can figure out what I missed. But basically what she's saying is she's partially to blame here, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh, that's what she's saying. Oh, it's me just reading it wrong. It's when your hands weren't clean, when there wasn't a single part of you that was, especially not your mind, all those deep, dark corners. First of all, besides all my butchering, and I apologize, it's so beautiful, right? She doesn't feel clean. So in today's day and age, right, when we have women, victims of a sexual assault, who have to basically testify about their own experiences, in some ways they're more on the stand than the men who they are accusing. Now, what is agency? Where do we come out on this?
I am not going to have a satisfying answer for you because it is something that, it is a question that like plagues me, and that I've devoted so much time as both like an academic before I began creative writing, and as a novelist, thinking through agency. I mean, I promise not to like geek out or go down this this rabbit hole too much, but when I was getting my PhD, I participated in a philosophy seminar with all these amazing philosophers and neuroscientists, and thinking about the question of agency and the human self, and whether we could ever pinpoint through science or philosophy or any means of like human discovery, if we could ever even pinpoint where agency was happening. Is it in your interior monologue? Not everyone has that. Is it like a thing that happens in the synapses in your brain? Well, it's really hard because sometimes you start to do things because your gut, the biochemicals in your gut tell you to. Anyway, so like I've been so fascinated in this question of like, what is agency? And what Shay is doing in The Last Housewife is trying to understand there are parts of her, she's carrying so much guilt, and she understands that she made choices in her past that brought her into the crosshairs. And not only that, but like once she was part of this sex cult, in college, that's not a spoiler, that's part of the back cover copy, but once she was part of the sex cult, she actively participated and actively felt desire to see people punished and to be rewarded. And she can't, if those emotions weren't true, what is true? Then how can she know what is real desire versus not? And so as she's telling her life story to Jamie and he's asking her these questions, they have a great relationship, but she's also using him to pressure test her own mind and her own story, to figure out like she likes it when he asks her those accusatory questions, because she accuses herself of things, and this enables her to like answer those questions. So to your point about like women victims in sexual assault and cases of sexual violence, they're absolutely on the stand in ways maybe more powerfully than the men who are accused of harming them. And there's this sense that you have to show that you are 100% a victim. That there's not one part of you, of your brain, that started that night wanting something, or that you are just like such a pure, clean victim. And I use those words with air quotes, pure and clean. And like that doesn't exist. And of course that doesn't exist.
Of course not, right.
And that standard is absurd. And so Shay is trying to figure out, and it's almost like this thing that you can't figure out. Shay's trying to figure out like, when did I start becoming complicit? Was it when I said yes to Dawn? Was it when I learned that I got power from men's attraction to me that predates when I met Dawn? Is it when I was put in these victimized positions when I was a young girl? Like, when did it start?
Right. And I think that the other way in which I love the relationship between she and Jamie is that she tells Jamie all these really, they're truths, but of course she sees them as ugly, and he's sort of startled by them as a way of sort of testing how much love do you have for me? Because I will show you the ugliest parts. And I think there's a part of each of us that wants to do that, right? We want to be able to say to our partner, to our husband, this is the ugly interior. This is the scary, dark corner. And if I show that to you, and to our parents, and to our close friends, will you still love me if I show you that dark, dark stuff? And for a lot of people, it's too scary. We have to keep that all inside, which really, and I think women more than men, although men, I think also they are not also good at expressing things. And so we keep it down, and it doesn't really serve us, right, to hold on to that. In fact, I think it probably does us, a real disservice. So
yeah, this is going to sound weird, but I actually look at the relationship between Jamie and Shay in this book as like one of the most romantic relationships I've written. It maybe sounds weird given the context of like the darkness of this book, but to me, exactly, you hit it like the nail on the head of the pure intimacy and vulnerability of telling someone the worst things you've done,
Right.
and owning up to it and living it, leaning into it, and that person saying like, I see why, and I
Right.
understand, and I'm
Oh,
still I still
yeah.
love you.
And he's a one, I think there was a risk in this book of sort of running down the track of like all men are evil, because
Yeah.
Shay's in a marriage also when the book starts, and you know, although he's not a sex cult leader, but he has his own versions of
Yeah.
sort of like control over her. And so Jamie represents this, this idea that of course there are wonderful men in the world, and of course there are wonderful partnerships. And I agree. I think Jamie is, and he's not sort of he's not like a, fluff, unrealistic male character. He reacts very strongly to what
Yeah.
she's telling him. He's protective. He's overwhelmed at times,
Yeah.
but he comes through for her in a way that I absolutely agree. I think it is the most, I mean, it's a fabulous relationship, and I imagine them, I imagine them being together. So, oops.
Yeah, I will. I was about to say something too.
Yeah, I was like, okay, wait, but we don't know. I'm not going to tell you. I don't know.
Yeah. I'll just say I get very interesting responses from readers about the two of them.
Oh,
So
you do.
yeah,
Interesting. Okay.
lots of
Okay.
questions. Uh,
Okay. Well, I can imagine. I can imagine that. So you actually were highlighting on something else that, of course, another note in my book, which is the idea that young women, and it reminded me of something because I'm 51, so it's been a long time since I was sort of a 14-year-old or a 13-year-old with sort of budding, womanhood, and the
yeah.
idea that we feel there is a sense of feeling sort of preyed upon,
Mhm.
when your body is changing at a time when your brain isn't really caught up to the idea of what that means. And
Right.
Shay says, which is so beautiful, it felt like constant surveillance and it reshaped me. Going outside became an event. I developed this hum of apprehension and extra awareness, like a sixth sense I always carried. Men were watching around every corner. I could run into them at any moment. I'm not being dramatic. Anything could be an invitation, even accidentally meeting a man's eyes, which of course I think every woman has felt, right?
Yes.
Where you smile at somebody because you're supposed to just smile at somebody, and all of a sudden you sort of get the impression that you've made an overture, which, you know, as a young woman or an older woman, you haven't meant to make, but it's
Right.
been interpreted that way.
I I have had the most incredible responses to this portion of the book, I have to
Mhm.
say, hearing from women, because it is, I think, so universal among women, this experience of hitting puberty, growing, like developing breasts, and developing your woman's body, and all of a sudden that like being plunged in cold water experience of people, men especially,
Yeah.
are paying attention to you in ways that you immediately understand, even if they aren't verbalized in catcalls or anything else, that you immediately understand is different and often predatory, not always, but I still, if you're 13 and men are looking at you as a woman, I think that is automatically predatory. I will just
Right.
say that.
I think that's fair. Yeah.
Yeah. So
13. Yeah.
I think that, and this is something that I'm still like wrestling with myself, just to be a little bit personal here, which I'm sure people just assume because I wrote this book, but like untangling, it really messes with your head when you're a young woman, because when your body changes and men are paying attention to you, it's this moment of like a double-edged sword, where you all of a sudden you're terrified to be outside because you're going to attract so much attention, walking down a street or in a restaurant. But at the same time that you're scared, you start to understand that you're commanding attention in a way
Power.
that you never have before. Yes, and it's power, and it's so
Mm-hmm.
messed up, but
Mm-hmm.
it is power. And for some women like Shay, and for me when I was young, it was like the only power that was
Right.
available.
Right.
There was no hard power like wealth or like access to things, because Shay comes from a working class family, as did I. And it was like the first experience of power.
And
And
I think that's
yeah,
true for many, for, you know, a lot of women, you know, in our families and in our communities, where it really did shift things. And this brings us sort of to the idea of, and I think this ties into everything we were talking about, is sort of, you know, the choices that we make, and where's our personal freedom, and where does that begin, sort of the, you know, the seed of our personal freedom. And it's, so, you know, she says, the idea is that, we make choices based on sort of what we've learned, right? And the quote that I've picked up is, what if you've come to believe the options available to you are limited? What if the way you think about the world works is wrong? What if life taught you something false, or people lied to you, convinced you they knew you better? Oh, they knew better than you did. Can you really choose freely if you're mistaught? And that is just that's a bomb in the way that we're all, I mean, it's just, it sort of has to make your brain just explode with like, okay, wait. And that, you know, is any of us really, do we really get to make free choices after the time when we're, you know, we know anything about our, so any subconscious activity is
yeah.
happening.
Yeah, one past that moment of self-consciousness where you first begin to understand you're like living in a world with other people, and that your engagement with them is like gonna either give you things or withhold things from you, which is actually of such a young age.
Such a young age, right?
And this is my like PhD nerd coming through, because there's like so much written about that moment, because so many people agree that that is like when you're basically when you're a goner. It's
Yeah.
like after that it's like,
And what
you know,
age is it?
yeah.
Like 3?
So there's Lacanian theory that says like the mirror theory that says like there's this moment of power when a baby or toddler recognizes themselves in the mirror and
Yeah.
starts to understand
Yeah.
itself as a separate entity from its mother, and starts to experiment with the fact that it can cry, you know, like the different things that it does. There's like a self-awareness, that you are both apart from the world but can interact with it. That was so nerdy, I'm sorry.
No, I love
But
that. And
yeah,
I remember my kids when they would recognize themselves in the mirror, and they're not very old. They're a few months old, right?
yeah,
I mean,
and
they're,
it's
you
super
know, or
young.
even weeks, they're weeks old, but it's early, right? So yeah, so we're then, after that, we're all picking up signs that we get from our families and our culture and everything. That's
Yes, and so what does that do to the concept of free choice? And that's something that Shay is just grappling with, because she has done things that she feels enormous guilt for, and that
right,
she is being told she shouldn't.
right,
And she also has choices that she knows are hurtling toward her, at high speed,
right,
and she's trying to figure out what to do.
right.
And not to spoil, you know, anything that you learn later in the book, but so much of what you get at the end of the book is you're left with the question of like, what were Shay's choices,
Right,
really?
right,
And you know, like, is she really so guilty?
right.
You know, that's like the
I mean, I feel like it's a very powerful thing. I think everything that happened to her leads to, yeah, leads to, you know, where the story takes us. And it makes, you know, I think that is right. It is, I mean, you know, as a person who's been in that situation, that is a form of, you know, mental abuse that is imprinted on her, forever. You know, there's not a lot of escape from that. Shay is the main character, but there are 2 other women, sort of 3 women that went to school together. And I thought it was interesting. So you know, when I was thinking about these 3 women, there's Laurel and Shay and Cleo. Am I messing that up?
Clementine, yeah.
Clementine. Okay,
Clem.
right, Clem. Sorry, yes. And I thought it was interesting that, you know, so for two of those women, their father figures were not present,
Yeah.
right? And for one, they had a father figure, although they didn't really see eye to eye with their parents for, you know, whatever reasons. And I wondered, it was interesting to me And I wondered if it was a conscious choice, that the one character who sort of resisted, although they all, of course, complied with into the cult, and they were all, complicit in whatever ways they're complicit, because of course they were sort of drawn there and trapped. But the one that had the father figure sort of fared in many ways. She was able to sort of hold on to her independence a little more anyway.
Yeah.
And I wonder if that's, do we think that having a father figure, having, maybe, even a decent father figure or an okay father figure really does serve us as women in a way that having no father figure doesn't?
Yeah, that's such an interesting and provocative question, because I didn't even put those pieces together until you said that. No, but I think that there's something there. And I very consciously, Shay and Laurel both have absent fathers in different ways, right?
Yeah.
Like Laurel's father is a man she loved very, very much and lost.
Right.
And Shay's is a man who, walked away from her. But yet Clem has this father figure who isn't great by any means, and she doesn't feel particularly close to. But I think that there is really something to be said about the fact that Clem comes from a large family, she and a little bit of her own personality mixing in there too, of just like coming from this large family and being the oddball out. I think having learned to like think independently and autonomously, I think is what sets her up the most to be resistant to Dawn. But I'm also realizing now that I don't think I've written a single book with a strong father figure, despite the fact that I have one.
Right.
So I think I need to like talk to my therapist about that and see what that means.
Yeah, I think it's so that even that comment probably speaks to the fact that we do, a strong male figure, and obviously the more sort of, accepting and he is of his women, his female children, and what they want and need. It's important, and I don't think, obviously there's a lot of incredible single moms doing the job and a lot of single dads, but I think there's something to having that a male role model who shows us that, this is how you love a woman, and this is how you, you encourage your daughters to be who they want to be, and not, not back down. So I thought that occurred to me, and all three characters are, really interesting. And I think, I've heard you talk about your father, and he sounds amazing. How does your father feel about these books?
He has not read The Last Housewife yet. So far he's a great supporter of my work, and has not commented on the either missing or bad dads in all of these books. But I think like so much of the books that I write are infused with kill your father energy. And by that I mean like in the academic anti-patriarchal sense of like kill your father.
Sure.
Like the father is the patriarchy. The father is the thing that the system you're born into, who takes care of you in a very paternalistic way. And so maybe that's why there's so many absent or twisted fathers, because they're books about getting rid of them. And it's kind of interesting to me, as you were describing the role of a good father, which I totally agree with, that I had Jamie fill that space as a man.
Yeah.
Interesting. More fodder for my therapist.
I know for the next books. But no, I do, and I think in the same way that what you recognize in your books, and my mom would always comment that all the mothers of my characters were always dead. And I think it's what we realize is that there's something really important about that foundation, right? About having those, and that can, and oftentimes when we're already there's already difficulties just with being a young person, and especially, if we're marginalized by, our community, or wealth, or all the other reasons people are marginalized, then family, parents can make a more massive impact. So I think it's worth. I don't think I'm sure your dad feels very safe in his love.
I've recently given him permission to read The Last Housewife, so I'll let you know
Yeah.
what he thinks about
I'd
this
be
one.
curious. Well, I mean, he knows you as his daughter, and you are somebody who
Yeah,
thinks, and talks very openly about these issues. So he's
yeah,
probably it's probably not going to come as too much of a shock for
yeah.
him. And you're part
Probably
of a
not.
big. Are you part of a big family? Is that right?
I am, yeah. I'm the oldest of 4 kids, and then my parents are still together. So we've been a little unit of 6 for, all these years, and grew up with my dad being in the military. So we
Yes.
hopped around every 2 years.
Wow. Yeah. So are you
Um,
close? Are you close in age? You
we're
sibling?
4 and 4 years, so we
Okay.
like literally couldn't be closer, and we've just been like a little unit my whole life.
4 in 4 years. Tell your
God
mother
bless my
I'm
mother.
very impressed. That
Yeah.
is, ooh, that is. So I'm the oldest of 4 also, but and my parents were married for 35 years. My dad's gone, but they had, my baby brother is 17 years younger than I am. So they sort of did it.
Wow.
And my mom had, some struggles with pregnancy, but they're 4 years and then 9 years. And then the 2 boys are 4 years apart. So my sisters,
Wow.
so it's kind of a sort of a different, we're also our own little unit, but a very different one. So it's,
Oh, I love
um,
that.
but I think there's something about being the oldest. We can talk about that another time, but
Oh my gosh. Yes, basically I fit every stereotype of being the oldest.
me too.
The oldest daughter especially.
Yes.
Yeah. So
Yeah. So I understand. Well, we won't talk about all the need
yeah.
for control and stuff. We can talk about that
Yeah.
later.
I fused a lot of it into Shay, to be honest.
And I actually, what a great way, right, to sort of channel these things that we need to work out for ourselves. I do love the
Yeah.
process of writing because I think you get to explore all the versions of yourself, right?
Oh my gosh, yes.
All the ways and all the sort of, roads that we go down just in our minds, we can now go down in words, which is really, I think it's very powerful. I think it's very cathartic. I think everybody should probably write somewhat, whether or not they want to share. And
Totally agree.
speaking of that, so Shay tells Jamie that she feels like there's no such thing as an objective observer, and
Mhm.
that's why stories are so powerful. So she says, if you're listening, you're part of it. And I love that. I love that because I think that is so true. It's why we say, a man lives one life, a reader lives 1,000 lives. Is that part of the reason you think you write?
Oh yeah, that's such a great question. Yeah, absolutely. Trying to make readers like complicit. No, trying to like have a conversation with the people on the other side, who are reading. Absolutely. And to kind of harken back to what you were also just saying, so beautifully put about like the cathartic joys of writing. Like I have a joke that I self-soothe through my books, and like I'm just like working through, like you said, all of these different pieces of myself book by book, and it's like this conversation I'm having both with myself and with readers. Like here's a thing that I've experienced, and here is it magnified and
Right.
made into a narrative. What do I think about this? What do you think about this? Is this in you too? And you can't be a reader and have an emotional response to a narrative without being part of it. I think that, you are then welded together in some way. And so that is both a wonderful thing, but it's also a power that can be wielded to kind of negative effect, and something that I was really cautious of when writing The Last Housewife, because it's such a dark book. And I understood that my readers would be in it with my characters. And so I really thought long and hard about what to put on the page and
Right.
where to be visceral and allow brutality versus when to pull back.
Yeah.
And that was something that my editor and I had a lot of conversations about. And so the final copy of Housewife, which is more or less what the ARC version as well, but looks very different from the first few drafts.
Interesting.
I just went full tilt in those
Sure.
first few drafts.
Yeah.
But I also think that there's a lot of power in a visceral experience when reading.
Right.
And so your reader is there, your reader is part of it. There's no objective observer. Knowing that when you as a writer put certain brutal scenes on the page, you understand it's going to have a pretty big impact on your reader. And I think that that's important because every day we have to numb ourselves, right? To brutality, injustice, rage, all of these things, watching the news. Like, we have to numb ourselves as a survival tactic just to get through our day to day. But we also need to feel and encounter the rage and the fear, and the dark stuff. And I feel like books are a really great place to do that. Because the reader is in control. You can put the book down if you need to, and not return to it if that's your choice. But like, this is a space for that. I think a safe space for that. So, that was kind of in my head as I was writing. But I think, again, not to spoil the Last Housewife, the end, but that statement about no one's an objective observer just comes back to haunt you in the end of the book. So that was me trying to do a little bit of foreshadowing.
No, and I think it's really successful. And I think it is true that a book, unlike sort of a screen, where it's sort of shoved down your throat, a book allows us to sort of take in as much as we can take in. And also it makes us interpret in our own brains what we're reading. We have to make the picture ourselves. And I think that makes it that much more powerful too, right? We're sort of, what we're really numb to, right, is just violence everywhere. It's on the screens, it's on our video games, it's, and so, but when it's in a book and you are creating it, right? Because the reader is creating the story. You're just giving the words to create it. So the reader is picturing this in their own way. And I don't feel like, one of the things this book does not do, it's not a, there's not depiction of, a massive amounts of violence, even though of course it's a sex cult. So, there's some understanding that happens, but no, I don't feel like you didn't need to, and you do a very good job, I think, of not necessarily shoving that, so far to the reader that readers feel like they can't get through it. Because I think it's important that we get through it, right? But that's the whole idea, is that this is how we learn what goes on in the world, is by being able to see these things and taking the time to digest them, which a book also gives us. And sometimes a 20-second news does not, right?
I have to admit that, like, there was a part of me writing this book that was like, if I have to feel it like a sledgehammer, then you're gonna feel it like a sledgehammer, and it's gonna feel like being a woman in the world feels like being like a thing you can't escape from. And like, I want to recreate that, then you're gonna have to feel that, like a little bit of that, while writing the book. But then on the other end, in the editing process, I would lay awake at night sweating, worried, and like running through every scene, making sure nothing was gratuitous. And if there was anything that was in any way rehashing something that the reader already knew, that I would take it out or pull it back, so that every scene of violence was earned. And I hope that
I feel that way. I feel that way 100%. I think the lessons about sort of the struggles of being a woman are really, and I hope that the men who read this book will also engage with that, because I think this is not a man-hating book at all, right? This is Shay is a woman, and we are seeing it from her perspective, but we are also very much living from Jamie's perspective, and about a man who loves a woman and understanding how that is for him. And I think his emotion, although we're not in his head necessarily, but we see his emotion very clearly in, what goes on in those conversations between the two of them. One of the things that this book made me think about, that I of course always struggle with, is the idea that, women are so hard on one another. There's this, there's the joke that says that women could run the world if we could just get along. And I sort of wonder if it's these things that sort of fester early in our youth, where we're told sort of what's important and what our value is. And if we're told that our value is beauty and, procreation and, in the kitchen, or what, those sort of more traditional, roles, versus if we're told that, our power can be anywhere, and we can be in the boardroom, and we can be in the surgical suite. And is that what, like, remember, there's of course the famous sort of Oprah scene with the women who stay-at-home moms versus the women who are working moms, and just the vitriol that goes back and forth between these women. And I wonder if it's because the inbred or taught, learned insecurity in us is so fierce that we have to cling so tightly to whatever role we take, right? We can't, there can be no room for sort of another way.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And like, I mean, what better way for a patriarchy to remain in power than to set women, against one another, and to foster so much insecurity? Because what's really at the heart of all of this, I think, is that as women, we are taught, and even if you are, a queer woman, or just everyone, men are taught this too, so it has nothing to do with like sexuality or gender, but we're all taught that our value revolves around what value we bring to men, for men to other men, for women to men. So like, what a value, how much do you appeal, whether it's through your service to them, in the kitchen or elsewhere, through your beauty, through whatever it is, like how much do you appeal? And that is the measure of your power. And I think it's that like is a thing that causes the women, certainly of the Last Housewife, to fracture and be at odds with one another, but also just in life. I think that is the and it's so interesting to me too, and this is something that I grapple with. And so like in The Housewife, what I'm doing is just putting all of my own struggles and like suspicions about my own brain on the page. But it's like, no matter how much I consider myself a feminist, how committed I am to supporting other women, there are still those knee-jerk moments that you have when you encounter a powerful woman who has something you don't, and your brain flickers immediately to, how dare she, I want it, how can I have it? Like shove her aside,
right?
In a way that I don't know that it happens the same with men, because there's like this thing that my brain automatically thinks that I can't have it, and there like it tries to go in another direction. But man, that flicker that has to be tamped down, like that. I'm so suspicious and angry that that is a thing that has been conditioned in me. But it's a thing that, like, if you don't work, I'm convinced maybe we all experience some degree of it, and so that brings me a little bit of,
for sure. Absolutely. And I think men too. I mean, I think men feel it too. It's just that it feels like with women, it's sort of like there's a scarcity problem, right? There's only these many spots up here for women.
Yes.
So if she has it,
totally.
I don't have it.
Yep.
But with men, I think it feels like, okay, there's plenty of room up here. You can be here, I can be here, we can all be here. It's sort of, the good old boys club. But with women, I think we see it feels scarcer. And so it's sort of an either or. I mean, that's my perception.
So perfect. No, that's so perfectly put. And that, like, the cult in The Last Housewife literalizes that.
Right. It really does. Right.
And yeah, that is absolutely what it is. I think that is, like, for listeners who are going to read the book, like the thing to keep in mind between Laurel and Shay,
right,
is, which is all I'll say.
Yeah. And there's, and I mean, so there's a bunch of other characters, and I probably should wrap this up, but I want to talk about Nicole for a second.
Yeah.
Because she's this sort of, she's this woman who's in the sex cult, who sort of embraces the sex cult. And she talks about that, basically her whole life has been sort of what she calls a passing of ownership, right? Like a title
Yeah.
change. That she had an alcoholic, abusive father, and then her parents turned to religion, but God wanted her to be a certain way, and then she
Mhm.
fell in love, and then he wanted her to be a certain way, and then what was more painful than falling out of love? Well, that was as excruciating as her sort of upbringing. And so she basically says, it's the same story everywhere you turn. Anyone who tells you different is blind or trying to sell you something. At least with this situation, she says it's out in the open. At least here I'm walking in with clear eyes, loving your pains, the only control you get. And the way, she's a minor character, but she's so beautifully painted and so vivid. And she does this incredible job of helping us understand, another way of helping us understand, why women turn to these organizations.
Yeah, or thank you so much for saying that. First of all, I love Nicole.
Yes,
And I
me
didn't
too.
know how much I would love her when I first
Mhm.
started writing this book, and then just like fell in love with writing her. She's like the nihilist, right?
Mhm.
She's the pragmatist. Here Shay and Laurel and Clem to some extent are all going around trying to like untangle why, and Shay especially like, oh, but can there be other ways, and why do I want this, and why are some parts of this attractive to me? And Nicole's just like, look, this is the way the world works, honey. You think you alone are gonna like solve this intractable thing that has existed for as long as humans have existed?
Right.
No, like this is bare life. Like
Yeah.
what you are looking at is life stripped down to the truth of how it works. And so you either are going to get on board and get the most you can out of it,
Right.
or you're going to have some like non VIP version of
Right.
patriarchy, I guess, to use her parlance.
Exactly.
So I loved writing her because I think that is very much an attitude that exists in the world, and there's a lot of like, it's compelling. There's certain parts of it that are compelling, and I think it's like why some women lean in to being wholly financially supported by their husbands, for example.
Right.
Why you have trophy wife culture, why you have all of this culture of like, I'm just, why not be supported? Why not like, and then you have to say things like, well, if it goes away, what's going to happen to you? Or, if there's any change in like your husband's affections or your material conditions, like your whole situation changes, and like, have some power outside of it. But
it's interesting because the flip side of that also is that so the sort of obvious suggestion then for all women would be financially independent. But then if you enter children into the equation, it's almost impossible, it's unsustainable to have two working parents and raise kids. So naturally we have this sort of one person becomes the breadwinner and one person becomes the caregiver. And in our society, women are paid less, way larger percentages of time, and then they step out of the workforce even just to get the kids into kindergarten, and then they've lost traction. So it's sort of set up right for us for for failure.
Yeah, the system is set up to disempower women. And like, I know that we are seeing that on mass scale during the pandemic too, as like a perfect example of exactly what you're saying, that you see all the cracks in this system that we've set up when that pressure is applied. And of course, we've seen so many women leave the workforce because someone needs to do childcare,
homeschool
and
the children.
The expectation is not only just the expectation, but to your point, even if you're being completely like pragmatic about it, so men are like typically paid more. So if someone's going to step out of their role,
it's a financial, it becomes a very easy financial decision,
and then masks all the things that aren't easy, like that aren't fair at all about that.
Of course. And then put on top of that, the new, overturning Roe v. Wade, and we just have another way that we are disempowering women. So,
I mean,
well,
yeah,
we
that
won't,
was when that happened.
I know.
I like, after being in walking around in a fugue state, even knowing it was coming because of the
Yeah.
leak, did
Yeah.
nothing to like stop the gut punch. But after walking around a fugue state, I was like, well, the Potter Society has entered the Supreme Court of the United States, which of course, like, was true before
Yeah,
that
we knew that,
ruling,
right?
but yeah, we knew that, but still.
Yeah. I mean, I have a 22-year-old daughter, and she was in Prague at the time, and I just got a very long sobbing phone call. I mean, we knew it was coming, but you know, what do I tell her? Like, what, you know, actually my advice was stay in Prague. I think that's probably a really lovely place. And, you know, anyway, and we could talk for hours about that. But okay, the last thing I want to ask, I have two more questions, and I'm going to let you go. The first one is that, and we sort of talked about this, but I wanted to make note of it because I thought it was so interesting. And one of the things you mentioned at the back of your book, there's some questions, which I love, you know, when that you have questions for the author, and you said, you know, you write about the things that you're afraid of, which I think is very relevant. I think that is something that most of us do. People are oftentimes like, is it feel empowering to write about these scary things? And I'm like, well, I don't know that it does. It's just a way of sort of excavating all that fear. And you said one of the things you said is that maybe you're afraid of yourself, which I think is also a really honest, you know, confession. Do you want to add anything to that, since I've outed you?
Yeah, I'm just putting it all out there, I guess. And just like, yeah, I was thinking a lot about why I write the kind of books that I write across In My Dreams and Housewife, and this new thriller I'm writing right now. And I realized that the thing that attracts me and the scariest part of these books to me are the way that the main characters like cannot trust themselves, have parts of their brains that are unknowable they're strangers to themselves. And that is a thing that I think all people experience, at least to some degree.
Yes.
And for those of us who experience to like increasing degrees, it is so terrifying to plumb the depths of your own brain sometimes.
Right.
And so I think that if there's anything that like unites all of my books, it's that it's that like the scariest thing is your own mind. Like Shay says, there will be no greater antagonist than your own mind.
It feels so true. I think it's worth exploring, and it's worth putting out there that is true for everybody. That there are parts of you know, of ourselves we only probe in very quick moments in very dark rooms, you know, because that's there. So it was lovely, and I have chatted you way long here, but so the last thing I want to ask, because you already just alluded to it, is what is next for Ashley Winstead? Because when can I get my hands on it?
Yes, as soon as you want it.
What are you working on?
As soon as I'm done writing it. So right now I'm writing my next thriller that will be out in 2023. It's called Midnight is the Darkest Hour, and it is a serial killer story set in a fictional town in Louisiana, and it stars a woman that I'm really loving writing right now. She's a preacher's daughter, and so I'm plumbing really deep on ideas of like what is good and right. And she's my youngest character I've ever written. So I'm thinking a lot about girlhood and how that's constructed, especially by men who are telling you what it means to be a good girl. And
a preacher of all men, right?
Yes, of all men. So religion is big in this book.
Yeah. And these are important topics. It's so fascinating. Anyway, I actually honestly could talk to you for a weekend.
Same.
So, but I thank you. I can't thank you enough for joining us. If you haven't read In My Dreams, I Hold a Knife, is fabulous. And this, The Last Housewife is a lot of people have a sophomore slump, but we did not see you have a sophomore slump. So this was fabulous. Like I said, I made tons of notes. I loved it. Thank you so much for joining me today, Ashley.
Thank you so much. This has been an absolute joy. I could talk
Thank
to you
you.
forever.
I know, me too. And for those of you joining us, thank you for joining Killer Women, and we hope to see you next time. Bye.
Bye.